Chris Christie thought he could intimidate a freshman congressman on live television. What Jonathan Roumie did next left the chamber speechless and made Christie's political allies question everything they thought they knew about power. The lights blazed in the packed hearing room as tensions reached a boiling point. Christie, red-faced and pointing his finger, had just unleashed a verbal assault that echoed through the marble halls. His voice cracked with emotion as he gestured wildly, his carefully maintained composure crumbling before a national audience. But Roumie sat there, calm as still water, with something in his folder that would change everything. The contrast was striking. Christie's face flushed crimson with anger, while Roumie remained perfectly composed, his hands folded neatly on the table behind him. Staffers exchanged worried glances, knowing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as spectators tried to process the explosive moment unfolding before their eyes. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just go viral, it rewrote the rules of political confrontation and may have shifted the balance of power in Washington forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these jaw-dropping political moments that are reshaping America. The mahogany-paneled hearing room felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Senator Chris Christie, his usually composed demeanor cracking under pressure, gripped the microphone like a weapon. His voice, normally smooth and measured, had risen to something approaching a shout. "This is absolutely ridiculous." Christie's words bounced off the ornate walls as cameras captured every angle of his mounting frustration. The golden light from the crystal chandeliers cast harsh shadows across his face, making his expression appear even more severe. "We're not going to sit here and listen to these baseless accusations from someone who clearly doesn't understand how this process works." The acoustics of the chamber amplified every word, creating an echo effect that made his outburst seem even more dramatic. Press photographers in the gallery clicked rapidly, capturing the moment for tomorrow's headlines. The tension was so thick you could practically taste it in the recycled air of the windowless room. Across the room, Representative Jonathan Roumie sat perfectly still. His dark suit was immaculate, his posture straight but relaxed. A legal pad sat open in front of him, covered with meticulous notes in his precise handwriting. While chaos swirled around him, he appeared to be the only person in the room who wasn't affected by the mounting tension. The hearing had been scheduled as a routine oversight meeting, but nothing about this moment felt routine. Christie's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats as his voice continued to rise, their faces showing embarrassment at their colleague's loss of control. Roumie's supporters watched with fascination as their freshman representative maintained his composure in the face of a verbal hurricane. "You want to question my record?" Christie continued, his finger now jabbing toward Roumie's direction like an accusation made physical. The gesture was so aggressive that security personnel around the room subtly adjusted their positions, unsure whether the situation might escalate beyond verbal confrontation. "You want to sit there and act like you have some moral authority? Well, let me tell you something about experience and respect." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying an emotion that went deeper than political disagreement. This wasn't just about policy differences. This felt personal, as if Roumie's questions had struck at something fundamental about how Christie saw himself and his place in the political hierarchy. The room fell silent except for the whir of cameras and the scratching of reporters' pens. The air conditioning system hummed in the background, a mechanical counterpoint to the human drama unfolding. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen, but no one could have predicted just how dramatically the next few minutes would unfold. The tension was so palpable that some spectators held their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might trigger an even larger explosion. To understand why this confrontation mattered so much, you need to know who these two people really are and what brought them to this explosive moment. Chris Christie had built his career on being the measured voice of reason. As a former governor of New Jersey, he'd carefully crafted an image of dignity and restraint. For years, he'd been the party's go-to spokesperson on issues of political accountability and fiscal policy. Someone who could bridge divides with his calm demeanor and personal story of rising to political power. But lately, cracks had been showing in that carefully constructed image. Political pressure from all sides had been mounting, and Christie's usual diplomatic approach was being questioned by his own base. Conservative activists had begun whispering that he was too willing to compromise, too eager to be liked by the establishment. Some critics whispered that he'd become too comfortable, too willing to go along to get along. The pressure had intensified after several high-profile votes where Christie had disappointed both sides of the political spectrum. His attempts to thread the needle between competing interests had left him vulnerable to attacks from purists in his own party and skeptics across the aisle. The careful balance he'd maintained for years was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. On the other side sat Jonathan Roumie, the freshman representative from Texas who'd already made waves since arriving in Congress. A former public defender and civil rights advocate, Roumie had never been one to back down from a fight. His background defending the powerless had given him a steel spine that many career politicians lacked. Roumie's rise to Congress had been meteoric. His ability to stay calm under fire and bring a fresh perspective to pressing issues had set him apart from his colleagues, earning him admiration for his level-headedness in the most charged of political environments. After years of representing clients who couldn't afford high-powered legal teams, Jonathan Roumie had developed an ability to cut through political rhetoric and focus on practical outcomes. His courtroom experience had taught him to remain calm under pressure and always have his facts straight before making an argument. His law school professors remembered him as the student who would stay up all night preparing for mock trials, who would research every precedent and anticipate every possible counter-argument. That same thoroughness had followed him into politics, where he approached every hearing with the preparation of a lawyer heading into a major case. What made this confrontation so explosive was the context. The hearing was supposed to address voting rights legislation, but it had devolved into a broader argument about representation, accountability, and who had the moral authority to speak for their communities. The room was filled with lobbyists, activists, and reporters who had come expecting routine political theater, but were about to witness something far more significant. Christie's frustration had been building for weeks. Roumie had been asking pointed questions about his voting record, specifically his opposition to certain civil rights measures. His research was thorough, his questions precise, and his unwillingness to accept political non-answers had clearly gotten under Christie's skin. Each session seemed to chip away at his carefully constructed political persona. What made it worse for Christie was that Roumie never attacked him personally. He never raised his voice or made inflammatory statements. Instead, he simply asked questions and waited for answers. His patience made Christie's evasions even more obvious. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and everyone could see it happening. For Roumie, this wasn't personal. It was about accountability. He'd come to Congress with a mandate from his constituents to ask hard questions and demand real answers. His calm persistence had already made several senior members uncomfortable, but he wasn't interested in playing the traditional freshman role of staying quiet and learning the ropes. His background as a public defender had taught him that patience and preparation could overcome any advantage in position or power. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Christie's reputation as a statesman was on the line. Roumie's credibility as a serious legislator hung in the balance. But more than that, this moment represented a clash between the old way of doing politics and a new generation that refused to be intimidated by titles or seniority. As the tension mounted, everyone in the room understood that this wasn't just a disagreement between two legislators. This was a defining moment that would establish who had the moral authority to lead on the issues that mattered most to millions of Americans. The confrontation had been building for nearly an hour before Christie finally exploded. It started with routine questions about voting statistics, but Roumie's persistence had clearly struck a nerve. The hearing room had gradually grown more tense as other committee members sensed the building conflict. Earlier in the session, Christie had seemed confident, even relaxed. He'd answered initial questions with his usual polish, falling back on practiced talking points about bipartisanship and constitutional principles. But as Roumie continued to press him with increasingly specific questions, his responses had become shorter and more defensive. Other senators on the committee had tried to intervene several times, attempting to redirect the conversation to less contentious topics. But Roumie had politely but firmly steered the discussion back to Christie's voting record, each time with a new document or statistic that seemed to contradict his previous statements. Senator Christie, Roumie had begun in his characteristic calm tone. "I'm looking at your voting record from the past 2 years, and I'm having trouble understanding how you can claim to support voting rights while consistently opposing measures that would expand access." He paused deliberately after each question, giving him ample time to respond while making it clear he expected substantive answers. His legal training was evident in his approach. He asked questions like a prosecutor building a case, each query designed to establish facts that would support his larger argument. Christie's initial response was measured, falling back on talking points about election integrity and constitutional limits. But there was already a tension in his voice that hadn't been there earlier. His staff, seated directly behind him, began exchanging concerned glances as they recognized the signs of their boss's mounting frustration. But Roumie wasn't satisfied with generic answers. He had clearly done his homework, and he wasn't going to let standard political deflections satisfy his line of inquiry. "I understand your concerns about federal overreach," Roumie continued, "but when you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, were you thinking about the grandmother in my district who has to travel 40 miles to find a polling place that's accessible?" That's when Christie's composure first cracked. His voice rose slightly as he responded. "Representative Roumie, I think you're mischaracterizing my position and my motivations." But Roumie pressed on. He pulled out a thick folder and began citing specific instances where Christie's votes had directly impacted voting access in communities of color. His questions weren't hostile, but they were relentless in their precision. "Senator, in 2021, you spoke at length about the importance of ensuring every American can vote. But just 3 months later, you voted against funding for additional polling locations in underserved communities. Can you help me understand that apparent contradiction?" Christie's jaw tightened. Around the room, his staffers exchanged worried glances. This wasn't going according to plan. Christie's communications director, a veteran of dozens of contentious hearings, had never seen her boss this rattled by questioning. She frantically typed notes on her phone, already drafting potential damage control strategies. The other Republican committee members were growing increasingly uncomfortable. They recognized that Christie was walking into a trap, but the format of the hearing made it difficult for them to intervene without appearing to shield their colleague from legitimate oversight questions. "Representative, I think you're taking my votes out of context," Christie replied, but his voice had an edge now. "There are complex budgetary considerations that you might not fully understand given your limited experience with federal appropriations." The condescending tone was subtle, but Jonathan Roumie caught it immediately. So did everyone else in the room. The suggestion that he, a Harvard-educated attorney with a background in constitutional law, couldn't understand complex issues hung in the air like smoke. Several reporters in the gallery began typing more rapidly, sensing that the exchange was about to escalate. The Democratic members of the committee perked up, recognizing an opportunity. They had been trying to get Christie on the record about his voting patterns for months, but he had always managed to deflect their questions with his usual charm and political skill. Now he was clearly frustrated and making unforced errors. "I appreciate your concern for my understanding, Senator," Roumie replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps you could help educate me by explaining how a $50 million allocation for voting infrastructure would have compromised fiscal responsibility when we just approved $800 billion for defense spending without a single question about budgetary considerations." The room grew quieter. Reporters leaned forward. Christie's allies began to look uncomfortable as they realized their colleague was being systematically dismantled by someone they'd underestimated. "That's a completely different issue," Christie shot back, his voice rising. "Defense spending is a constitutional mandate. So is ensuring the right to vote," Roumie interrupted smoothly. "In fact, it's mentioned more frequently in the Constitution than defense spending is." Christie's face began to redden. The careful mask of senatorial dignity was slipping, and everyone could see it. "Representative Roumie, I don't think you understand the complexities of federal budgeting or the constitutional limitations on federal involvement in state elections." There it was again, the suggestion that he simply didn't understand. But this time, Roumie's smile disappeared entirely. "Senator Christie, I've reviewed the constitutional provisions extensively. In fact, I've argued constitutional law before federal courts. Are you suggesting that my legal education is somehow insufficient to understand the 15th Amendment?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Christie realized he'd walked into a trap, but his anger was now clouding his judgment. "I'm suggesting that academic understanding and real-world legislative experience are two very different things," he replied, his voice getting louder. "And I'm getting tired of being lectured by someone who's been in Congress for less than 2 years about issues I've been working on for decades." The outburst sent a ripple through the room. This was no longer a policy discussion. It had become personal, and everyone knew that personal attacks were dangerous territory, especially when they came from someone who'd built his reputation on being above such behavior. Roumie sat perfectly still, letting Christie's words echo in the chamber. He didn't respond immediately, didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he simply opened his folder and pulled out another document. "I understand your frustration, Senator," he said quietly. "But since you've raised the issue of experience, perhaps we should examine what that experience has actually produced." That's when Christie completely lost his composure. "You know what?" Christie suddenly erupted, his voice echoing through the chamber with shocking intensity. "I am sick and tired of being disrespected by someone who thinks she can waltz into this building and question the integrity of people who've been fighting these fights since before she was even thinking about politics." The explosion was so sudden and violent that several people in the gallery visibly jumped. One woman in the front row dropped her purse, the contents scattering across the marble floor. Security guards positioned around the room tensed, unsure if they needed to intervene. Christie was on his feet now, his finger pointing directly at Roumie, his face flushed with anger that seemed to radiate heat across the chamber. "You want to talk about voting rights?" he continued, his voice approaching a shout that echoed off every surface in the room. The microphone wasn't designed for such volume, creating a slight feedback that made his words even more jarring. "I've been fighting for voting rights while you were sitting in law school classrooms. I've lived the struggles you only read about in books, and I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who has no idea what real leadership looks like." His breathing was heavy, almost labored, as if the outburst had physically exhausted him. Sweat beat on his forehead despite the chamber's air conditioning. His usually perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled from his animated gesturing. The chamber was dead silent, except for Christie's heavy breathing and the rapid clicking of camera shutters. His outburst had been so intense, so far outside the bounds of senatorial decorum, that everyone seemed frozen in shock. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys as if she couldn't believe what she was supposed to record. His staffers looked mortified. His political allies stared at the floor. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. But Roumie hadn't moved. He sat there, hands folded calmly in front of him, waiting for Christie to finish. His expression wasn't smug or triumphant. It was patient, almost sympathetic. When Christie finally stopped speaking and collapsed back into his chair, breathing heavily, Roumie waited several more seconds before responding. The silence stretched out, building tension as everyone wondered how he would react to such an unprecedented attack. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear him. The silence had been strategic. He understood that in a room full of politicians who loved the sound of their own voices, sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply waiting. "Senator Christie," he began, his tone gentle but clear, "I can see that you're passionate about these issues, and I respect that passion, but I think your reaction might actually prove the point I was trying to make." The words hung in the air like a chess move that suddenly revealed an entire strategy. Christie's eyes widened as he realized he had walked directly into Roumie's trap. His explosive outburst hadn't just made him look unprofessional. It had actually validated every point Roumie had been making about his approach to governance. The genius of Roumie's response became immediately apparent to everyone watching. Jonathan Roumie hadn't taken the bait of his personal attacks. He hadn't responded in kind with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he had used Christie's own reaction as evidence for his argument, turning his moment of weakness into Roumie's moment of strength. In the gallery, veteran political reporters began frantically typing, recognizing that they were witnessing a masterclass in political combat. This wasn't just a comeback, it was a complete reframing of the entire confrontation. Christie had tried to make it about experience versus inexperience, but Roumie had just made it about composure versus chaos, preparation versus impulse. Christie's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his political career, he was genuinely speechless. The irony was devastating. He had just spent several minutes shouting about leadership and experience only to demonstrate the exact opposite qualities in real time. Roumie continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. "You've just spent several minutes telling me that I don't have the experience or the right to question your record. But here's what I find interesting about that argument." He opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is your voting record on civil rights issues from 2018 to 2023. In that time, you voted against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You voted against the Freedom to Vote Act. You voted against the For the People Act. You opposed funding for election security measures in minority communities. You blocked judicial nominations for judges with civil rights backgrounds." He looked up from the paper, meeting Christie's eyes directly with a gaze that seemed to see right through his political persona to the insecurities beneath. Now, you've told me that I don't have the right to question these votes because I lack experience. But Senator, with respect, what good is experience if it consistently leads to outcomes that make voting harder for the very communities you claim to represent? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap that seemed to reverberate through every corner of the chamber. Around the room, people shifted in their seats as they processed the devastating simplicity of Roumie's point. He had taken Christie's argument about experience and turned it completely on its head, suggesting that his decades in politics might actually be a liability rather than an asset. The committee chair, who had been watching the exchange with growing fascination, made no move to intervene. This was exactly the kind of substantive policy discussion that hearings were supposed to produce, even if it was far more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. But Roumie wasn't finished. He had clearly planned this entire sequence, and he was going to execute it with the precision of a surgeon. You mentioned that you have been fighting for voting rights since before I was thinking about politics. But Senator, I was a public defender. Every day I represented people who couldn't afford lawyers, people the system had failed, people whose voices weren't being heard. While you were building your political career, I was in courtrooms fighting for individuals who had been disenfranchised by the very systems you're now defending. Christie's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. And you're right, Roumie continued, his voice still calm and measured. I haven't been in Congress as long as you have, but maybe that's exactly why my constituents sent me here. Maybe they were tired of experience that doesn't deliver results. Maybe they wanted someone who would ask uncomfortable questions instead of accepting comfortable answers. He picked up another document from his folder. This is a letter from the National Civil Rights Coalition from 2022, rating your voting record on civil rights issues. You received a score of 7%. 7%, Senator. The leading civil rights organization in America gave you a 7% rating on civil rights issues. The number hit the room like a physical blow. Several people audibly gasped. Christie's face went from red to pale in an instant. So, when you tell me I don't have the experience to question your record, Roumie said, his voice still maddeningly calm, I have to ask, what exactly has your experience accomplished? Because from where I sit, it looks like decades of experience have produced a 7% civil rights rating and a voting record that consistently makes it harder for people who look like us to exercise their constitutional rights. Christie tried to speak, but Roumie held up a gentle hand. I'm not questioning your integrity, Senator. I'm not questioning your intelligence or your right to your opinions, but I am questioning whether your experience has actually served the people you claim to represent. And I think the people have a right to know why someone with your background and your platform consistently votes against their interests. The silence that followed was deafening. Christie sat there, mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to find a response. His explosive outburst had been met with such systematic, calm demolition that he appeared completely disarmed. You asked what real leadership looks like, Roumie concluded, finally allowing a slight edge to enter his voice. Real leadership is being willing to be uncomfortable. Real leadership is asking hard questions and demanding honest answers. Real leadership is representing your constituents, even when it's politically inconvenient. He closed his folder and looked directly at Christie. And real leadership, Senator, is never ever screaming at a colleague for doing their job. The chamber erupted, the gallery burst into applause. Reporters frantically typed on their phones. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning. Christie sat frozen, his political career potentially irreparably damaged by 60 seconds of lost control and 5 minutes of surgical dismantling by a freshman representative who had just redefined what political courage looked like. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything anyone in the chamber had ever witnessed. As Roumie's final words echoed through the room, the explosion of applause from the gallery was so loud that the committee chair had to call for order multiple times. Christie remained seated, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. His carefully constructed image as a dignified statesman had crumbled in real time, and everyone had watched it happen. Within minutes, phones throughout the chamber were buzzing with notifications. The confrontation was already being clipped, shared, and analyzed across every social media platform. The first tweet appeared less than 60 seconds after Roumie finished speaking. Jonathan Roumie just gave a masterclass in how to handle a bully. This is what real leadership looks like. Roumie's calm, calculated response stood in stark contrast to Christie's red-faced, shouting outbursts. The visual narrative wrote itself. A 22-second clip of Christie's outburst, paired with Roumie's opening line, "I can see that you're passionate about these issues, and I respect that passion," went viral within the hour. The juxtaposition of Christie's rage against Roumie's composure created a perfect metaphor for the clash between old-style political intimidation and new-generation principled leadership. But it was the longer clips that really did the damage. 5-minute compilations showing the entire exchange, Christie's condescending comments, his explosive outburst, and Roumie's systematic dismantling of his record spread across social media like wildfire. The hashtag #7% began trending within 2 hours. The civil rights rating that Roumie had cited became a rallying cry for critics who had long questioned Christie's commitment to civil rights. Despite his rhetoric, political commentators across the spectrum struggled to process what they'd witnessed. Conservative voices tried to defend Christie, arguing that Roumie had been disrespectful and that his anger was justified. But the optics were impossible to spin. A senior senator screaming at a junior colleague simply looked bad, regardless of the political context. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, hailed Roumie's performance as a defining moment. "This is what it looks like when someone who actually understands policy meets someone who's coasted on image," wrote one prominent analyst. Roumie didn't just win that exchange. He exposed the hollowness at the heart of performative politics. But perhaps most damaging were the reactions from Christie's own party. Several Republican colleagues conspicuously avoided defending his outburst when asked for comment. One anonymous GOP senator told reporters Christie lost his composure, and that's never a good look. The substance of the disagreement aside, you can't lose control like that. The damage extended beyond social media and pundit commentary. By the end of the day, 3 major civil rights organizations had issued statements praising Roumie's principled stand for accountability while conspicuously failing to defend Christie. More importantly, the confrontation had shifted the entire dynamic of the debate around voting rights. Christie's angry dismissal of Roumie as inexperienced had backfired spectacularly, making him look like exactly the kind of out-of-touch politician that voters were tired of. Roumie, meanwhile, became an instant political star. His calm handling of Christie's attack demonstrated a level of political skill that impressed even his critics. He had managed to look professional and dignified while completely dismantling an opponent who had vastly more experience and institutional power. The broader implications were staggering. The confrontation had revealed the generational fault lines within American politics. Christie represented the old model of political figures who expected deference based on seniority and who relied on their personal stories to deflect criticism of their records. Roumie represented something entirely different, a new generation of politicians who came prepared with facts, who couldn't be intimidated by title or position, and who refused to accept experience as a substitute for results. The voting rights debate, which had been stalled in procedural arguments and political posturing, suddenly had new energy. Roumie's surgical dissection of Christie's record had refocused attention on actual policy outcomes rather than political rhetoric. Several moderate senators who had been silent on voting rights issues suddenly found themselves being asked why they were siding with someone who had a 7% civil rights rating. The political calculus around the issue had shifted overnight. Political talk shows across the spectrum spent entire segments analyzing the confrontation. Body language experts dissected every gesture and facial expression. Communication specialists praised Roumie's masterful use of silence and timing. Crisis management consultants used Christie's meltdown as a case study of what not to do under pressure. The confrontation became required viewing in political science classes across the country. Students analyzed how Roumie had used facts and composure to neutralize a more powerful opponent. The video clips were shared in leadership seminars and communication workshops as examples of grace under pressure. But perhaps most significantly, the confrontation had established new rules of engagement for political discourse. Roumie had shown that the traditional difference expected towards senior colleagues could be challenged effectively if you came prepared with facts and maintained your composure. He had proven that moral authority could trump institutional authority when backed by preparation and principle. Young politicians across the country took notice. If a freshman representative could systematically dismantle a senior senator's reputation in 5 minutes of careful questioning, what did that mean for the old power structures in Washington? The establishment's reaction was telling. Within 48 hours, several senior Democrats were praising Roumie's preparation and professionalism while calling for more substantive policy discussions. It was clear they recognized they were witnessing the emergence of a new political star. Christie's team, meanwhile, went into damage control mode. They released a statement saying the senator regretted his tone while maintaining that his substance was correct. But the apology only made things worse, making Christie look weak and confirming that his outburst had been inappropriate. 3 days after the confrontation, Christie's approval ratings in his home state had dropped by 8 points. Local newspapers that had traditionally supported him began running editorials questioning his temperament and fitness for high-pressure negotiations. Radio call-in shows were flooded with constituents expressing disappointment in their senator's behavior. Roumie's fundraising numbers, meanwhile, exploded as small-dollar donors across the country sent money to support the representative who had stood up to political bullying. His campaign reported receiving over $500,000 in donations within 48 hours, most from contributors giving less than $20. The geographic spread was remarkable. Donations came from all 50 states, suggesting his moment had resonated far beyond traditional political boundaries. Political consulting firms began studying the confrontation as a case study in crisis management and media relations. Christie's meltdown became a textbook example of how not to handle hostile questioning. While Roumie's response was analyzed in communication workshops as a masterclass in staying calm under pressure, the long-term implications were still unfolding, but several things were already clear. Christie's reputation as a dignified statesman was permanently damaged. His effectiveness as a spokesperson for conservative positions on civil rights issues was severely compromised. Several major donors who had supported his political ambitions began quietly distancing themselves from his future prospects. Campaign strategists noted that the confrontation had fundamentally altered the political landscape. Young candidates across the country began adopting Roumie's approach, coming to debates and hearings armed with exhaustive research and in maintaining composure, no matter how heated their opponents became. Political science professors assigned the video as required viewing, using it to illustrate how preparation and emotional intelligence could overcome institutional advantages. The confrontation became a case study in how power dynamics in Washington were shifting as a new generation of politicians refused to be intimidated by seniority or traditional hierarchy. Roumie, meanwhile, had established himself as a formidable political force. His combination of policy expertise, unflappable composure, and moral clarity had made him a national figure overnight. But beyond the individual careers involved, the confrontation had demonstrated that the old rules of political engagement were changing. Seniority and titles no longer provided protection from accountability. Experience was no longer accepted as a substitute for results. The confrontation between Chris Christie and Jonathan Roumie wasn't just a viral moment. It was a preview of the future of American politics, a future where preparation matters more than position, where facts carry more weight than titles, and where a calm, principled response can be more powerful than any amount of shouting. The video clips continued to be shared weeks after the initial confrontation, with new audiences discovering the exchange and drawing their own lessons from it. High school debate teams used it as an example of how to maintain composure under pressure. Business schools analyzed Roumie's performance as a case study in strategic communication and crisis management. International media outlets picked up the story as well, using it as an example of American democracy's ability to produce moments of genuine accountability. Foreign correspondents noted how the confrontation illustrated both the best and worst tendencies in American political culture, the potential for explosive conflict, but also the possibility for principled leadership to emerge from chaos. As the dust settled and the clips continued to circulate, one thing was abundantly clear. American politics had just witnessed the emergence of a new generation of leadership, and they weren't going to be intimidated by anyone. The old rules about deference to seniority and institutional respect had been challenged and found wanting. The story of Chris Christie screaming at Jonathan Roumie and his devastatingly calm response had become more than just a viral moment. It had become a symbol of changing power dynamics, shifting generational expectations, and the triumph of substance over spectacle. It represented hope that politics could still reward competence, preparation, and principled courage over political theater and institutional bullying. And for millions of Americans who watched a young, calm, and principled figure like Roumie systematically dismantle the arguments of a senior politician who had tried to intimidate him, it offered hope that maybe, just maybe, politics could still reward competence, preparation, and principled courage over political theater and institutional bullying. What do you think about Jonathan Roumie's response? Did he handle Christie's outburst perfectly, or should he have taken a different approach? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible political moments that are reshaping American politics. The next generation of leaders is rising, and you won't want to miss a single moment of how they're changing the game.